Every who down in Who Newville liked the holidays a ton. But where to get great prices on gifts, they had no idea. None. They searched and they searched for great gifts under $25. Gifts for spouses and friends and even their toddlers. When suddenly one who shouted, Walmart has what you want, knowing they have Lego, Tree Hut, and no prices to flaunt. So they enjoy the holiday season as who's often do. Cheering and shouting, Walmart has incredible gifts. Who knew? Find gifts they'll love under $25 at Walmart.
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
It's early 1941. The codebreakers at Bletchley Park have cracked Enigma. They're now reading the top secret messages of the German Navy. In this episode of Spymasters, I want to look at this incredible story from the other side. What did the submarine commanders think was happening? Did they know they were being watched? And what of Durnitz, the man in charge of the Wolfpacks who had destroyed and harried Allied shipping throughout that first crucial phase of the war? How much did they know? How much did they guess about their top secret codes being broken? To tell the story of Enigma from the German perspective, I'm delighted to introduce the top historian, Roger Moorhouse. My name is Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and a journalist, and I have another podcast with Roger called The History Book Buffs, where we review history books, fact and fiction. But today, it's Spymasters, and I'm talking to Roger about his new book, Wolfpack, Inside Hitler's U-Boat War. Join us as we talk Enigma, code-breaking, and submarine warfare. Roger, thank you so much for coming on the Spymasters podcast.
My great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Listen, I'm really excited about talking to you today because I've just finished reading your brilliant book, Wolfpack. And I wanted to get you onto Spymasters to talk about something that I really have wondered about for a very long time.
Right.
Which is, obviously, I've read quite a lot about Bletchley Park and I've read quite a lot about Enigma, and I've thought about the cracking of the German codes very much from the Allied perspective and what it's meant on the Allied side of the coin. And obviously your fabulous new book is about the U-boats of the Kriegsmarine in World War II. And I wanted to talk to you about the other side of the coin, the other side of the Enigma story, the U-boat side of the Enigma story. So thank you for joining me, and let's get into it.
Yes, let's do it.
So just as a sort of brief overview, so the Poles actually started reading the German Enigma codes quite early on, right? From the early
famously.
Yeah, and you're obviously also a famous Poland historian.
I have a Polish hat that I don occasionally. Yes.
So the Poles are quite often written out, really, of this story. I'm thinking specifically, I guess, of the, Alan Turing film, Enigma.
Yeah.
There's no Poles in that. So
yeah. I think that even made the most egregious error, deliberate or otherwise, that I think that film even portrayed the Poles as the bad guys in the narrative. Which is, I can see why that might have upset some of our Polish friends, but there we are. Yeah, no, absolutely. So they are there at the beginning of the Enigma story. It's three Polish mathematicians that, have essentially already broken Enigma before World War II. And they hand over all of those, their workings, and I think a sort of a version of the Enigma set is sort of handed over to the British and the French in July 1939, so just before the war starts. Essentially, I suppose, in a way to say, here you go, this is what we've done, you run with it. And that's pretty well, that's that bit of the story. Actually, you're right in a way that the Poles get written out because this is their own. It's part of the sort of the Polish neurosis is that, they think they've always been forgotten and written out of history. But actually on this, I think nowadays people kind of understand that the Poles broke Enigma first. And the same as the Polish contribution to, the Battle of Britain and stuff like that. I think those are two chapters that we do kind of get. So they hand it all over, and then, Bletchley Park is sort of up and running from late 1939 to try and carry that work forward. and apply it, in a sense, apply it in real time to sort of try and, they have to then, because of changes that the Germans make and different models that they introduce and different methods, they use that baseline of understanding to then have to re-break it numerous times. So it's not like it's a one hit. You do have to sort of keep breaking it.
Right. And in theory, you need, there's the theoretical position, which, as I understand it, the Germans quite rightly believed that in order to break the code, if everything was done perfectly without human error, would require computation lasting 900 million years.
Yeah.
But obviously there were human errors which allowed the codebreakers to wriggle into the gaps.
Yeah.
I also, as I understand it, I've read that the Army and the Luftwaffe guys made many more mistakes than the Kriegsmarine guys. So it was much harder to crack the naval codes. So can you just talk to me briefly about, so the early stages of the war, when the Wolfpack that you write about so brilliant in your book is causing absolute havoc across the British shipping. At that point, we're not really spying on them. So where are they sending messages to? How are they sending messages? What is it that, we need to crack? What is it that Enigma will help us to solve? What's the problem that we need to solve?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say every U-boat. I think there are some that don't. I think perhaps the sort of coastal variants and so on that do has an Enigma machine, but essentially every U-boat has an Enigma machine. They have a radio operator who sort of has to send out the messages back to the control, whether that's in Brittany or elsewhere, back to the submarine high command, Dönitz and so on, and then receive instructions back again, which are encrypted and then have to be decrypted by the radio operator and then handed to the captain. And they use these. So their methods are a bit tighter than, like you said, the others, because they, like the British break, for example, Luftwaffe Enigma already in 1940. Kriegsmarine, the German Navy Enigma, is a bit more difficult because they have a different model of Enigma machine, which is a little bit later on, but they introduce with an extra rotor. That's a little bit later in 42. But they have different procedures, like stricter procedures as well. So it proves more difficult to break than the others for the reasons that you say. And one of you mentioned the human error of how they get in is, essentially, you could look at any message and you could make the fair assumption that the last or the penultimate sort of two words of any message is going to be Heil Hitler. And so that almost gives them a key in each time to try, can we try and break it on that basis and see because, I'm sure everyone knows, it's sort of infinitely variable, using the pin board and the keyboard and so on. So if you can actually get a way in, like using that and say, assuming that's Heil Hitler, what does that, does that enable us to work with anything? And that's one of the ways that they could sort of get in and start to break it. But yeah, so, the U-boats, everything is encrypted, all the communication back between, which is about where they should be positioned, where the convoys were, all of that sort of information is then decrypted, and it's written out on this sort of really onion thin kind of pink paper, which was designed so that it would essentially dissolve in water. So as soon as the U-boat was compromised or otherwise damaged, this stuff would just turn into mush straight away. So they've got some decent procedures in place to prevent getting broken. And the key moment for the Allied breaking of naval Enigma is May 1941. Is the capture of a U-boat called U-110, which was essentially, the captain of U-110 was aiming to try and scuttle it. So essentially, he'd been depth charged. He brings it to the surface in the standard way, gets his men off the ship, and he supposedly wants to sort of scuttle it to make sure it sinks, which is standard procedure, right? Abandons ship, expecting to watch his U-boat sort of tip up and go beneath the waves, and it doesn't. And the captain himself, his name was Lemp, sort of floats away. He actually drowns, and he probably drowns. It's been suggested that he drowns out of shame for having essentially allowed his U-boat to be captured. Because pretty quickly there's an away party rows over to U-110 from HMS Bulldog, which had been depth charging it, and they dive below, and it's all kind of inundated and it's all a bit of a mess, but they managed to rescue the Enigma machine and the various code books and so on, and that's sort of spirited back onto HMS Bulldog and taken away. And Lemp supposedly sort of watched all that and essentially allowed himself to drown out of shame. But that gives Bletchley Park a massive leg up in the breaking of naval Enigma, obviously, because they've got the machine, they've got the code books, and they can actually start putting two and two together in real time and see what happens. So that gave the British suddenly an in that they really hadn't had before. And it doesn't last forever, is the key thing. So, even within months, they're having to re-break another code. So it's a very hit and miss process. Like I said before, it's not just, you break it once and that's it, because there's constantly new variants of machine and new sort of code systems being introduced. But crucially, U-110 gives them that in. And they're actually able to basically sort of steer convoys around Wolfpacks in the summer of 1941, which they hadn't been able to do before. So it's a vitally important.
So can you just give us then the kind of before and after picture of what it looked like in terms of the kind of strike rate for a U-boat convoy, U-boat pack? How much difference did it actually make, that kind of spring 1941? How much difference did it make to the Battle of Atlantic?
But it's very significant. I mean, by the spring of 41, actually, the Germans are beginning to, be hit a little bit, because they lose their, three most prominent commanders, Schepke, Prien and Kretschmer, 2 killed, 1 taken prisoner in March, all within a couple of weeks of each other, in March of 1941. But it's still, things are still going well for them by that stage, essentially. And Wolfpacks are, operating reasonably well in the western approaches and further out into the Atlantic. And a lot of them are sort of, of individual U-boats are sort of returning from a patrol, having sunk, maybe 5 or 6 vessels, and with a total tonnage sunk of, perhaps we could say, something like 30 or 40,000 tons. And this is chipping away all the time at the Allied merchant fleet, very effectively. So this is the same time in which, the Allies are beginning to be very concerned about the possibility that Britain could be strangled, and that rationing will have to be massively tightened up, for example, and belts that are already tight will have to be tightened still further. The strike rate and the success rate was pretty good in the spring of 41. And then once after the capture of U-110, for example, there is that window, as I said before the sort of the ability to read those German messages is lost, and it is lost later in that year, temporarily, but lost none the same. You have the same commanders going out on patrol again, and essentially sailing around the same hunting grounds that they had been before, western approaches and elsewhere, and coming back completely empty-handed, having sunk precisely nothing. And all of them going, what the hell's going on? This worked. This method worked. 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and suddenly it doesn't. And it's not even isolated examples. There are numerous examples in late 41 of exactly that. The commanders going out and coming back empty-handed. So, and this is basically the Allies being able to know where the Wolfpacks are, and essentially, to put it very simply, steering the convoys around them.
And what are these U-boat commanders saying? What are they writing in their diaries and saying to Dönitz? What message is coming home from the packs in the ocean?
It's just incomprehension is the only way you can describe it. They don't really understand what's going wrong, because these are the same methods and the same hunting grounds as they'd worked in before and hunted in before to great effect, and then suddenly they're coming up with nothing. So there's really no inkling that there's something else going on. They're just thinking, oh, well, we must be in the wrong place, so we'll go out and try again. So they try again. So there's really not yet this idea that something must have gone wrong at a technological level to enable this to happen. They just think it's bad luck. The sort of consternation and the soul searching, I suppose, it comes a little bit later on.
Do you think that they are, do you think that my understanding is that they just didn't realise that Enigma had been broken. They thought it was unbreakable, okay,
exactly.
And that led them into the poor decision making. Was it possible that, like, the coming in of the Americans in that period, what was going on in Russia, was it just were they kind of with their eye off the ball, or was there or was it just a kind of refusal to see the obvious truth, or what was going on? Like, it seems with hindsight very clear that obviously that must be what has happened.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. You can look at Dönitz's own memoir. The head of the U-boat arm. He was sentenced to 10 years at Nuremberg, and then came out and wrote his memoir, which is called, I think, 10 Years and 20 Days, I think it's called. which came out in I'm tempted to say 1957 from memory. And he says in his memoir, we considered Enigma to be unbreakable. He doesn't know then, even in 1957, that Enigma had been broken. So he even says in that, I don't think it was ever broken. So there's just sort of consternation. The Enigma story itself only broke, in historical terms, it only really broke, I think, in the 1970s. So even in 1957, Dönitz is still thinking that Enigma was never broken. So how you sort of rationalize your failings at that point is to blame everyone else. You blame, perhaps the training regime is not as good as it was. The crews are not as good as they were. The commanders are not as good as they had been. I mean, they had lost those three most prominent commanders in the spring of 1941. So it's quite easy to say, well, maybe the commanders we've got out in the field now are not that good. Maybe they're not as good as the other guys, the ones we've lost, which is also true, right? So the quality of that sort of second rank, if you like, of crews and of commanders is, less good than what had gone before. And the quality that deteriorates all the way through the war, incidentally. So that very first rank were very competent, had pre-war experience and all that sort of thing. And then as soon as you're into using their deputies now as the new commanders, then they're the ones that are essentially coming up with these poor figures and drawing a blank. Then it's quite the logical answer is to point to them and say, well, they're not up to scratch. So, we need to work them harder. We need to tell them to do better. The idea that there's a technological reason behind these failings, it doesn't even enter their minds.
So then in this brief period where they're unreadable again in the sort of early to mid 1942. At that point, presumably, can you see a commensurate increase in Wolfpack successes?
Yeah, there is another success, and particularly because early 42, they have this sort of next phase. They referred to the opening phase of the war as the happy time, when they were, not unopposed, but they were scoring pretty good successes against, Allied convoys. In the spring of 42 onwards, there's this opening of what's called Operation Drumbeat, which is, taking the war to the US. So the US Eastern Seaboard, because the US, of course, had joined the war in December of 41. And this is Hitler essentially sending his U-boats to attack the American Eastern Seaboard and all the freight traffic that's going on there, in the expectation that the Americans would not be up to speed with security measures, countermeasures, procedures, and so on. And absolutely right in that assumption, by the way, because they weren't. So in a sense, any further failings due to Enigma are actually sort of masked by the fact that through most of the first half of 42, they're actually scoring pretty good figures off the American coast because of the shortcomings actually of the Americans themselves, because they were very slow to get up to speed. They didn't black out, for example, that Eastern Seaboard. So if you're close enough to shore, you could see your targets at night, sort of silhouetted against the lights of wherever it was, Florida and North Carolina and everything else. So in a sense, if you looked at it sort of purely statistically, as I'm sure to some extent they did, it wouldn't necessarily jump out at you that there was still a problem, because that became the sort of second happy time when they're actually scoring some good successes again.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels. On everything from lamps to ceiling fans. Even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes. Now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox. Clean feels good.
Dripping in gold? That's cool. Dripping in Velveeta's supremely creamy golden cheesiness? That's respect. Elevate your drip with Velveeta's range of outrageously delicious dips and dishes. Shells, cheese, melty blocks, and heat and eat queso that go all in on indulgence. Flex on your fam with a creamy, cheesy masterpiece and go all in on what you love with Velveeta. Respect the drip and satisfy your cravings. Bring home the drip with Velveeta.
Right. And then so, in 1943, basically, by that stage, we pretty much were reading everything, right? But by that stage, as I understand it from reading your book, Atlantic particularly, the Wolfpack were just kind of done, as you say. These these were not happy times. If you were a U-boat.
No, 43 is the sort of telling moment really in the U-boat war. It's when, Dönitz essentially goes toe to toe with the Allies. He's got the force that he always wanted. He always talked about wanting a 300 U-boat force, which doesn't mean 300 U-boats out at once, because that's kind of not really possible. But it means 100 U-boats out in the field, as it were, 100 being refitted and then 100 traveling between the two. But it meant that you could have 100 U-boats out in the field at any one time and keep that presence constant. So he's got what he wanted, what he'd already argued for right from the late 90s. And he goes toe-to-toe with the Allies. But the problem is that, that having the numbers that he finally has, it's too late, because, Allied countermeasures have been perfected to some extent. Convoy measures and protection measures have been perfected. And of course, you've got the Enigma is now being routinely read by Bletchley Park. So they've got the information of where these guys are as well. So they're really, really up against it. So by the time they've got the weapon that they always wanted, from a German perspective, the window of opportunity that they may have had has already closed. So you have this sort of, titanic, like two heavyweight boxers, going at one another in the spring of 1943, which essentially goes through, March, April, May 1943. Huge losses actually on both sides. But crucially, the Allies essentially they have more capacity to replace their losses than the Germans do. So you've got Liberty ships, that can be produced over, from numerous American shipyards in a number of weeks. You can produce one of these 6,000-ton merchantmen. So we're replacing lost merchantmen quicker than they're being sunk. And the Germans can't do the same with their U-boats. So sort of two heavyweights going toe-to-toe, and in May 1943, it's the Germans that back down. And Dönitz actually says, we essentially lost the Battle of the Atlantic. And it is a withdrawal. They withdraw the Wolfpacks. It doesn't mean they withdraw entirely, because there are still sinkings in the Atlantic right to the very end of the war. But essentially, the U-boat force dissipates, almost across the globe. And so they're sort of raiding in the South Atlantic and the Mediterranean, the Arctic, and also in the Indian Ocean by that stage. So that's the sort of the climactic moment. And Enigma obviously plays a part in that. It's both technological and it's logistical as well. It's industrial, the advantage the Allies had, as I said, with Liberty ships, and it's the technological advantage of the
one of the things that I found astonishing reading your book. Well, there are a number of things I found astonishing, but one of them was the casualty rate amongst the U-boats, which you've just referred to the kind of losses. But I mean, the U-boat losses were unbelievable. Was it over 75% of the submariners were killed?
Yeah. Which is the highest loss rate, I think, of any arm of any service in World War II. And it is quite astonishing. 30,000 of the 40,000 German submariners are killed during World War II. And to get a scale as well of the way in which the war turns against Germany, from really 43 onwards. If we take 43 as that sort of hinge point. And it's amazing how, we were talking recently when we're with our other hats on, on History Book Buffs, we were talking about Saul David's book about Tunisgrad. We're sort of crossing the streams now, Senior. I apologize for that. But we were talking, about, spring of 43 as that sort of crucial turning point, weren't we? And to some extent, the turning point in which the Germans kind of failed to turn, because they failed to realize that the writing's on the wall, or they can't, they're so blinkered that they can't realize that the writing's on the wall. But that's absolutely plain as day in the U-boat war. Because prior to, if you look at, say, 1940, for example, 41, statistically, for a U-boat crew, had the statistical lifespan of between 7 and 9 missions, 7 and 9 patrols. By 1943, that's down to about 3. And from then on, it goes down, obviously. It keeps going down. So by the end of 1944 and into 45, it's hovering around 1. And by 45, it's less than 1, right? So they're basically being hunted to extinction. I've got to get my figures right. But of the, I think it's about 400 U-boats that are commissioned and put into service are in 43 and after. So in the last essentially 2.5 years of the war, only about 14% of them actually sink anything at all, right? So they're essentially sitting ducks because Allied countermeasures and all that stuff that we talked about are by now so effective, or at least air attack, which is another aspect that we got to talk about. It's so effective that, you know, they're hardly getting close to enemy vessels, and certainly not any existing convoys, before being counterattacked and very often, as we said, hunted to exhaustion, forced to the surface, and then sunk. The stats are absolutely shocking.
I found it actually so heartbreaking because, I mean, you know, obviously they're in the service of a horrific and you know, vile regime, but a lot of these people who were dying on these U-boats in the latter half of the war are children. I mean, they're boys. They're you know, and they were on for one mission and they're sunk. All hands, never heard from again.
Average age of the dead is 22.
It's just terrific. At a point where the war was already effectively lost as well.
Yeah, it is. It is horrific. And I think that element, and I bring that across in the book as well, that element of them being sort of total losses, that the family would get absolutely nothing, right? Nothing would come back. I mean, maybe, you know, you get your sort of haversack or whatever you left at the base, that would be sent back to the family. But whatever you took with you, the things that are dearest to you, a Bible, perhaps a family photo of a loved one, you know, the girlfriend, the wife, whatever, all of that just disappears. That's all at the bottom of the sea, you know? And just that idea of the family having no body to bury and just no word, nothing, it sort of amplifies the horror, really, in the sense of loss. And I tried to bring that across. I know that's across many, many different arms of service and different countries in World War II. Many people shared the same experience. But given the nature of the fighting in the Battle of the Atlantic and beyond, and the nature of how a U-boat sinks and how it is defeated, I think it seems especially sort of brutal and especially poignant in that case.
I mean, you bring across horrifyingly the terror of being in a small metal tube under the water as you're being hunted effectively by Allies. And the idea that added to that sort of image is the fact they know exactly where you are because they've been listening and you don't know. I find quite extraordinary. And so obviously, I mean, they have to turn their deciphering victories into operational victories. And you mentioned the air attacks there. I mean, we should just talk about that very briefly. So one of the things they can do, so in the early bits of reading the code, the main weapon against them was just steering away from them.
Yeah.
But now the Allies, knowing where they are able to send in planes and attack them from the air. And that's a new development that really turns the war. Can you just talk me through that?
It is. I mean, it's not only, knowing essentially where they are. I mean, it's never, 2020 vision that they have. It's always a little bit partial and a little bit, compromised in some way. So let's not overstate that point. But they can essentially sort of track via the messaging that the U-boats are sending back to their base and so on. They can essentially track where they are. So if you can then send, a sort of squadron of aircraft to go and intercept, then all the better. And it's much quicker and much more effective to attack from the air, as they discover. If you're on a corvette and a destroyer and you have to catch up with and track down a U-boat, and it can see you coming from about 20 miles away. I think that's about the distance at from sea level that you can actually see. So they can see you from a good distance away. They will have dived and got out of the way before you get anywhere near the target area. Of course, there's ASDIC and so on that you can still detect your foe, your enemy. Most of the sinkings by the mid stage of the war onwards are actually from air attack, which I think most people perhaps don't appreciate, because you can be on top of the target. Within 30 seconds of being spotted, you're dropping bombs on them. And it takes generally, a good U-boat crew would take about 25 seconds to dive. So this is very touch and go as to whether they can, get out of the way at all. And they're being located by radar as well. So this is the other key development, is the Allied development of airborne radar, having small, effective radar sets that actually work, in these aircraft. So what the Germans do to counter that is they develop radar detectors, so they can detect when they're being detected by radar, right? So it will ping. Initially, it's called METOX, which is a very primitive one. Looks like a sort of Heath Robinson-esque kind of piece of a wooden diamond with wire around it. And it would ping when they had been detected. So that gave them early warning that an aircraft was coming, so they could dive and get out the way. But then, of course, as soon as they're there was a new version of the radar set that the British developed, which worked on a different frequency, so METOX didn't pick that up. So then they're being sunk from air attack, and they're going, well, the METOX isn't working. So and then there's this belief that the METOX was, again, the assumption is that the METOX not only isn't working, but it's actually betraying their position, which is completely untrue, but it was the assumption that they made. So a lot of them kind of, essentially throw it overboard and say, well, we're not going to use that because it's not only not working, but it's betraying our position. So then they're sort of doubly blind. This is where you can see the German crews in a very kind of human way are sort of running to try and make sense logically of the situation that they face, but without all of the information or with wrong information. And they, in the case of METOX, for example, they just come up with the wrong answer because they assume that it's actually betraying them when it isn't. It's just not picking up the updated radar signal. That whole element of it where you can see the Germans, as I say, kind of desperately trying to make sense of a situation when they only have half the information is really fascinating. It is actually slightly comical, but it's also rather tragic, I think.
Roger, I'm going to pin you down. I'm going to ask you like an A-level question.
Oh, God.
How crucial in the final reckoning do you think the cracking of the Enigma code was in the winning of this particular theatre of war?
There are, as I've said, there are a number. I'm going to have to give one of those kind of.
Oh, you're going to equivocate.
I'm going to do one of those boring A-level answers that comes up with a B+. But there are numerous factors that contribute to the Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic. So the logistical one of closing the air gap is crucial, as is the Enigma and its contribution to actually knowing where these guys are, as is the technological in terms of the shift from using depth charging to using Hedgehog spigot mortars, which is a much more effective destroyer of submarines than depth charging was. And also, as I said before, aerial radar, which is much more effective even than Hedgehogs. So all of that together means that the U-boats are absolutely up against it. And that first, the first successes that they enjoyed was those really experienced and mature crews that were fighting the first couple of years of the war. Once they're gone, you've got, as we said, essentially boys and really, in many cases later on, not very well-trained crews at all. All of that combined causes the collapse of the U-boat effort. If I had to pick one,
remember what podcast you're on, Morehouse. Come on.
If I had to pick one, Antonia Senior, I think I'd have to pick Enigma as the decisive contributor and the Codebreakers, because it's.
Would you though? Come on. I'm going to let you speak freely. You may speak freely. The decisive one.
I honestly think if I look at the stats, I mean, I didn't, this isn't a question I asked myself when I was writing the book, to be honest, because that's not the gist of the book, right? The book is about trying to tell the German experience and so on. So this is a little bit thinking on the hoof, but I think actually I would say that the development of aerial radar is probably crucial because the numbers that are destroyed by aircraft far outweigh the numbers destroyed by surface vessels. And I think that's something that we probably traditionally don't really appreciate. I think the sort of the stereotype that we have in our heads collectively is of, the corvettes and destroyers trying to engage U-boats in that way, like Greyhound, the Tom Hanks film
that
came out recently, or the Cruel Sea, or, Das Boot or whatever. The reality actually is that many more U-boats are actually sunk from aerial attack, and it's because of that development of radar that they could basically be on top of a target before they could even dive.
Right, so the U-boats are on the surface; they're not being hunted.
Oh yeah, no, exactly, because they spend most of the time on the surface. Those U-boats that Germans use, mostly Type 7s or Type 9s in World War II, are essentially submersibles. They cruise on the surface and then they submerge to attack or to evade counterattack. So apart from that, they're on the surface. So they're very susceptible to aerial attack. And of course, as I say, they can see a corvette coming from about 20 miles away. They can't see an aircraft coming out of low cloud, until it's on top of them.
Amazing. Listen, thank you so much. It's so interesting to hear it from the other perspective. I would hugely urge people to go out and read your book because it's absolutely incredible. It gave such an incredible picture of apart from anything else, what it was like to try and fight on a submarine in this war. And short answer, horrible.
Absolutely. The only thing I would add, thank you for that recommendation, Tony. It's very, very kind of you. It is, trying to fill a gap to tell it from that German perspective, because I think that hasn't really been done. And, it's not meant to be, how do we say, sympathetic, because that would be a bit daft, but certainly I think on a human level, at least empathetic, to actually give some understanding to, what that generation of submariners went through. And I think we owe it to our general understanding of the history of World War II to understand what the experience of the enemy was. It doesn't mean we sympathise, but I think we owe it to ourselves to understand that as best we can. And that's what I've tried to do.
Well, I definitely came out. I think I came out of it a bit too sympathetic. I had to give myself a stern talking to. But that wasn't your fault. That was my fault.
Being too emotionally engaged.
Yeah, exactly. But listen, I urge everybody to read it, but also to pre-order it, because it's out in a couple of weeks.
Yeah, it's out October 9th, it's out.
Yeah, and it makes a big difference. So if you were minded, I would say, listeners, to read this amazing book, I would get in at the ground level and get in now, because it really helps writers, doesn't it?
Absolutely, because that that all counts. It's all good. So, don't wait. Do it now. You go onto Amazon or wherever it is that you order your books and order it up. We'll be very grateful.
Yeah.
Be eternally grateful.
Almost as grateful as the Codebreakers at Bletchley Park when they got their first Heil Hitler.
Indeed. Beautiful segue. Beautiful segue.
I know.
That was amazing.
It was very clunky, but thank you. Listen, it's been an absolute joy. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast, Roger Moorhouse.
My great pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spymasters podcast.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.